stop what you're doing, because what the world heard in that speech was not just another warning, it was the sound of a geopolitical line being crossed, and the full consequences of that moment may not be visible yet. Investors heard one thing, governments heard another, and ordinary people around the world heard a darker message hidden underneath it all, that the standoff was not cooling down. It was moving into a far more dangerous phase. Within minutes, the reaction was brutal because markets do not wait for speeches to become history. They price fear in real time, and the message from Wall Street to Tokyo was unmistakable. Something enormous had just changed. Before I go further, I want to say something important because I work hard to analyze these developments, collect the news, and break it down for you. Yet many of you still do not like, share, or subscribe. And even though I reply to your comments, I still feel disappointed, so please support Market Mindset, and also follow our backup channel, Market Mindset 2. And now, before the story goes any further, understand this clearly. The speech was supposed to bring relief. It was supposed to calm the panic, and it was supposed to tell the world that the crisis had finally found its ceiling, but instead, it did the exact opposite. For weeks, there had been quiet signals that a ceasefire framework or a de-escalation path might be emerging, and that possibility was enough to make traders, diplomats, and analysts believe the worst might finally be behind us. But the moment the speech began to harden into a threat rather than a solution, that fragile hope collapsed, because the language was no longer about stability, it was about pressure, leverage, punishment, and the possibility of something even larger still to come. That is why the first thing markets did was not wait for clarification. They ran, because when uncertainty turns into a weapon, investors do not stay brave for long. In the United States, stocks dropped sharply, and in the space of minutes, enormous amounts of paper wealth vanished, not because one speech destroys an economy overnight, but because one speech can reveal that the next phase of a crisis is already being prepared. The damage did not stop in America, because once global investors sense that the Middle East is heading toward a wider confrontation, the shock spreads instantly, and the first casualties are always confidence, liquidity, and calm. Asia followed with losses. Europe braced for impact before its markets even opened, and every major financial center understood the same thing, that this was not a regional headline, it was a global economic warning. Oil surged, and that was the part many casual viewers misunderstood, because when a major energy corridor becomes unstable, the price does not fall, it rises, since the market is not only reacting to what has happened, it is reacting to what could be cut off next. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of that fear, because so much of the world's oil moves through that narrow passage that even the threat of disruption is enough to shake shipping routes, inflation expectations, and national energy planning across continents. That is the real reason this crisis feels bigger than a single speech. Because once the Strait of Hormuz enters the discussion, every economy connected to fuel, transport, trade, and industrial output starts to feel the pressure at the same time. And here is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore, because the message delivered to the world sounded like victory, yet the actions being signaled sounded like escalation, and those two things do not fit together cleanly. If the objectives had already been achieved, then why was a larger wave of pressure being discussed? And if the situation was already under control, then why did the tone of the speech suggest a new and more dangerous phase was about to begin? That is the question allies asked immediately, and it is the question many lawmakers asked publicly, because when a government speaks in victory language while preparing for a wider confrontation, confusion does not stay inside the room for long. Australia's leadership openly admitted it did not fully understand what the actual American objectives were at that stage, and European allies were left trying to interpret whether this was a final warning, a bargaining tactic, or the opening move of something far more serious. The problem is that confusion itself becomes a strategic weakness, because allies cannot support what they do not understand, adversaries cannot negotiate with what is not clearly defined, and markets cannot stabilize around a goal that keeps shifting. Now look at Iran's position carefully, because the picture is more complicated than the headlines usually admit, and the most important thing to understand is that Iran is not acting like a country that has run out of leverage. Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz, and even without fully shutting it down, the simple threat of interference is enough to move oil markets, create diplomatic panic, and force governments to think twice before escalating further. Iran also has its own energy network, which means the usual assumption that sanctions will quickly break its ability to function has not played out the way many in Washington expected. Over time, Iran has built trading relationships and supply channels that help it keep exporting oil and maintain domestic stability, and that matters because pressure only works when the target has no room left to breathe, and Iran still has room. That is why the Iranian demand set has actually become more focused rather than more scattered, because instead of chasing a dozen separate conditions, the central issue has narrowed into one major point, economic breathing space through the Strait of Hormuz. This is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign of strategic discipline. Because when a state reduces its demands to the one pressure point that affects the global economy the most, It is telling the other side exactly where the leverage now lives. Meanwhile, Iranian actions in the conflict have shown that this is not a conventional war in the old sense, because the targets have not always been traditional military positions, and the methods have often been designed to create economic and psychological pressure at the same time. Strikes on digital infrastructure, attacks tied to regional military gatherings, and pressure on supply chains all point to a doctrine built around disruption rather than direct battlefield symmetry. And that is why the conflict keeps producing outcomes that are hard to contain. In other words, this is not a fight where one side simply overwhelms the other with obvious force. It is a struggle in which infrastructure, energy, finance, logistics, and public confidence all become weapons. And that leads to the most important question in the entire story, the one that was not answered clearly in the speech, which is what success is supposed to look like in the first place. Is the goal to stop Iran's nuclear ambitions? Is it to break its economic backbone? Is it to force a political change inside the country? Or is it to reshape the balance of power in the entire region? Because those are four very different missions with four very different costs. If the goal is nuclear containment, then inspections, verification, and diplomatic frameworks matter more than dramatic threats. Because technical problems are usually solved with technical agreements, not with vague escalation. If the goal is regime pressure or regime change, then history becomes a warning instead of a comfort. Because the Middle East has already shown the world that removing a government is one thing, but controlling what comes after is where the real disaster often begins. If the goal is economic dominance over Iranian energy assets, then the world needs to hear what the long-term plan actually is, because striking an economy is not the same as building a replacement for the chaos that follows. That is why the lack of a coherent objective is not just a communication mistake, it is a strategic problem, because uncertainty at the top becomes instability everywhere else. While all of this is unfolding, China is watching with the patience of a power that understands time can be more valuable than force. Because every week the United States is absorbed in the Middle East is a week it is not fully focused on the Pacific. Every dollar spent on escalation in the Gulf is a dollar not spent on long-term deterrence elsewhere. And every fracture in America's diplomatic focus gives China more space to build relationships, expand influence, and wait for the strategic moment that benefits it most. That is how great power competition works now. Not always through direct confrontation, but through the ability to absorb another nation's attention while quietly strengthening your own position. And while governments debate strategy, ordinary people are the ones who pay first. Because when markets lose confidence, retirement accounts feel it. When oil spikes, gas prices rise, and when shipping routes tremble, the cost of groceries, transport, and energy starts climbing everywhere. In the United States, that means families, workers, investors, and retirees all absorb the shock through higher living costs and unstable markets. And in places like the United Kingdom and Canada, the same pattern repeats through energy dependency, trade exposure, and inflation pressure. In the Gulf region itself, the stakes are even more immediate, because millions of workers and families live with the possibility that one more escalation could disrupt economies, damage infrastructure, and turn an already tense region into a far more dangerous place. That human cost is often forgotten when leaders trade threats on television, but behind every headline are real people, real salaries, real homes, and real families who do not get the luxury of treating this like an abstract strategic game. And then there's the political front inside the United States, where protests have grown, public frustration has deepened, and many Americans are openly questioning whether the country is heading toward a confrontation whose end has never been clearly explained. That domestic tension matters because a government can project confidence on camera, but if the public starts doubting the mission, the strategy, and the price, then the political foundation beneath the crisis begins to weaken. So now the world is left with the same terrifying question: what happens next? Because the speech did not resolve the conflict, it sharpened it, and the next move could decide whether this becomes a negotiation, a wider military action, or a global economic shock that lasts for months. What we do know is this: the markets have already reacted, the allies are confused, Iran has not backed down, China is watching carefully, the Strait of Hormuz remains the biggest pressure point on the map, and the world is now waiting to see whether this was the beginning of a deal or the beginning of a much bigger disaster. And that is why this story is not just about politics. It is about money, energy, power, markets, and the kind of decision that can reshape the world in a matter of days, not years. So tell me your read in the comments. Do you think this was a real military ultimatum, a pressure tactic, or a calculated move to force Iran back to the table before the situation spirals further? And if the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted for more than 30 days, tell me how you think it would affect your country, your gas prices, your cost of living, your job, and your future. If this breakdown helped you understand the stakes more clearly, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, comment your opinion below, and subscribe to Market Mindset so you do not miss the next update.